saying sorry for historical wrongs, from a British massacre in India to Spain's conquest of Mexico. Demands for contrition are growing. Could Belgium start a trend in making amends after the Prime Minister apologizes for crimes committed during colonial rule? I'm Imran Garda, and it's a day of atonement here on the Newsmakers as we look at post-colonial apologies. Do they make a difference today? We begin our program with Belgium, which has apologized for the first time for kidnapping thousands of mixed-race children from one of its old colonies, that is today the Democratic Republic of Congo. Abducted children were put in schools and orphanages in Belgium run by the Catholic Church. Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel has admitted his country violated the fundamental human rights of mixed-race families during their 80-year system of targeted segregation in Africa. But can an apology be a remedy for those atrocities? Denise Savoya reports.
It was an apology 59 years in the making.
On behalf of the federal government, I apologise to the mixed-race people with roots in Belgian colonisation and to their families for the injustice and suffering they went through. I also wish to express our compassion for the African mothers whose children were torn away from them.
Under Belgian colonial rule, racial segregation was enforced throughout the Congo. Still, thousands of Belgian men had children with Congolese women. But fearing a rebellion from a mixed-race population, authorities ordered those children be separated from their families and from the black population as a whole. As many as 20,000 were forcibly taken to Belgium and put into orphanages run by the Catholic Church.
By setting up a system of targeted segregation against mixed-race people and their families in Belgian colonial Africa, the Belgian state acted contrary to respect for fundamental human rights.
Victims and their families were in Parliament to watch the government say sorry.
I'm very moved because after all these years the Prime Minister has recognised what we've been through. It's a recognition of what the Belgian state has done to us in collaboration with the Church. They took away a part of our identity and now they admit that mistake. I feel a lot better now.
Under the rule of King Leopold II, Belgium's actions in the Congo have long been criticised among the worst examples of colonial abuse. Monuments and statues built to honour Leopold's memory are scattered throughout the country, and they remain contentious. In 2004, vandals removed the hand of a Congolese statue at a Leopold monument in reference to the amputations carried out as punishment by the king's men in the Congo. This is the first time that Belgium has acknowledged any responsibility for brutalities committed during its 80 years of colonial rule. In February, a UN panel presented an interim report to the Belgian government saying there is clear evidence that racial discrimination is endemic in institutions in Belgium, and the root causes of present-day human rights violations lie in the lack of recognition of the true scope of violence and injustice of colonisation. It will present its final conclusions in September, but this apology is seen by many as an important first step in correcting Belgium's past wrongs. Denise Savoya, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Aberdeen, Scotland by Tom Bentley. He's the author of Empires of Remorse, Narrative, Post-Colonialism and Apologies for Colonial Atrocity. In London is Vava Tampa, activist and founder of Save the Congo, a campaign group working for peace in the region. And in Brussels, we have Philip Reinkens, a professor of law and politics at the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp, and has written extensively on the DRC. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Vava, the formal apology came to those children who were kidnapped, segregated. What does that mean to you as a Congolese person?
Well, I tell you what, I think it's something which ought to be welcomed. I am welcoming it partially or largely because people who have been direct victims of these crimes have also welcomed it. So it ought to be welcomed. It shows another thing. It shows that the Belgian state is beginning to move in the right directions. This is, your viewer would remember, this is the second Congo-related apology that the Belgian state has issued. The first one was in relation to the killing of Patrice Lumumba, and this is the second one in relation to the kidnapping of 20,000 Congolese children from their Congolese mother, brought into Belgium and mistreated.
Right.
So it's something which ought to be welcomed, but we also ought to remember that the Congo story, the Congo narrative remains incredibly absent from the Belgian curriculum in the education system, also in general in society. And until the Belgian state begins to have a conversation, an open conversation about what happened in Congo, then the issues that are continuing to affect the Belgian state in terms of discrimination and racism and so on and so forth could not be actually put an end to it.
Okay, so Philip, the point that Vava makes, this is not just about the kids. We've also seen the apology about Patrice Lumumba. We had a very program here this week on this very show about the genocide in Rwanda. Invariably, it brought up the fact that the Belgians had preferred the Tutsis over the Hutus and so on, and helped create the environment for this. Are we seeing Belgium starting to reckon with its colonial past now? Is this a sign of it?
Oh yes, absolutely, and this happens in many fields. The next apology, there have been apologies, of course, on several occasions, including last weekend by the current Prime Minister Charles Michel in Kigali about the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda. There has been recently a UN panel in Belgium to investigate the situation of Belgians of African, not just Congolese, but African descent. And there's a mass of recommendations made to the Belgian government, and that includes, for instance, and this is another apology that will be coming soon, I think, that Belgium should apologize about the entirety of the colonial period and the atrocities that occurred during the colonial period. So the apologies offered to the victims of what was indeed a kidnapping at a large scale. I should add, actually, that these were not just Congolese or children from the Congo, but also from Rwanda and Burundi, the two trust territories of Belgium. And I think this is indeed very important. There's a big discussion going on in Belgium and in other European countries, by the way, about, for instance, restitution of art that was stolen from African countries that are now in ethnographic museums in Belgium and elsewhere. There's a whole discussion in Belgium about statues in the public space, and particularly, of course, statues of King Leopold II. So there's a big movement going on, and of course this needs to be welcomed. I should add perhaps just one caveat, that offering apologies is, of course, a bit cheap. It doesn't cost anything, and I'm curious to see, for instance, what the Belgian government will do to stop daily discrimination of Belgians of African descent.
Tom, as somebody who studies this not only with regards Belgium, but also other countries and their former colonies, we've heard from Philip that apologies are cheap, and on the other side of the coin, there are people who say, well, apologies don't matter. They don't make a difference in this day and age. Do they make a difference? And did this apology, for example, regarding those kids, does it make a major difference?
Well, I think it does make a difference, but it's difficult to say what type of difference it makes. And the interesting thing about state apologies is that by necessity, you're apologizing to multiple people. So inevitably, it's going to make a difference to different people in different ways. Now, we've already heard one of your guests saying that many of the children, who are obviously now adults, are very receptive to the apology and they've welcomed the apology. But when you apologize to a number of people, there'll be some people that inevitably reject the apology or feel disappointed about the apology. In terms of apologies being cheap talk, I think governments are often concerned that they won't be cheap talk, and they're actually concerned that they're going to be attached to legal claims for reparations, for instance. Your guests have already mentioned the Patrice Lumumba apology, and actually when Belgium apologised for involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, they established a €3.5 million fund, and then supplement that each year with another €500,000. So in this case, it's not that apologies are free, but it was attached to money, but almost an insulting amount of money in how scarce it was.
Vava, so try to draw that line between an apology now and reconciling with the past to issues such as daily discrimination and racism within Belgian society today. Does the one make it easier to get to the other, in your opinion?
Well, I think it does. Look, the fact is quite clear. One of the key reasons that the Belgian state remains somehow incredibly segregated, and you don't really see a lot of Congolese faces or African faces in Belgian public spaces. What I mean is televisions, I mean the radio, I mean parliament, all the higher offices in the country. You rarely see Congolese or African faces. And one of the key reasons is because the relationships which the Belgian state had with Africa, more specifically with Congo. I mean, your viewer would remember that Rwanda and Burundi only became part of the Belgian Empire, if you like, after the World War I. It was a form of punishment to the Germans for all the brutality they had committed against the Belgian state, that the Traité de Versailles or the Versailles Treaty, under the League of Nations, to say, you know what, we're going to reward Belgium with Rwanda and Burundi, some sort of compensations. But one of the key reasons is those conversations haven't yet been had in Belgians. It remains a taboo. No one wants to talk about those things. And there are movements, and I'm really glad Professor Phillips has mentioned it, that are pushing for things such as, getting rid of the statue of Leopold II in public spaces and pushing this conversation forward. I mean, recently the Belgian had actually created a small tiny square in Belgium, in Brussels, and named after Lumumba as a way of forcing this conversation to be had. And I think until those conversations are had, and as a matter of national emergency or national priority, then the Belgian state could start moving forward and could start putting an end to some of its discriminatory ways of doing things or sort of building community together.
Philip, tell me if there's been any pushback in Belgium, because, for example, what we've seen during the right-wing populism that has emerged over the past few years across the European continent and in the United States. A lot of people say, hey, I'm a white person, I did not enslave black people, I didn't kill Native Americans and so on. This has nothing to do with me. We're in a democracy, we're all equal. Why are you bringing up all this old stuff? Has there been pushback within Belgium?
Not really. And to take the example of the kids who were kidnapped in the 40s and particularly the 50s of last century, there was no uproar at all. I mean, many people actually didn't realize that this happened. And certainly, even I didn't know all the details. There are no experts on this. I didn't realize, for instance, that people didn't even enjoy Belgian citizenship. So there were stateless people even after they had been transferred to Belgium. So this has been seen by the Belgian public as a natural thing to do. There's no uproar at all. There is more discussion about, for instance, the legal consequences, as has already been pointed out, the legal consequences of the, for instance, apologies for the atrocities or the plunder because of colonization, because there, of course, the idea of the potential idea of compensation might come up, and no one knows what the price would be. I mean, this has been, for instance, a discussion in Germany about the genocide against the Herero, in current-day Namibia, for instance.
Yes.
So the consequences are not very clear, although I should say, even for the thing that brings us together today, the kids that were brought to Belgium, there is a request that I think the government will meet to help those people, because that's a part of the past that isn't settled yet, to help those people to find their relatives in Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC.
Tom, was the crucial line that we heard there that many people didn't even realize that this happened? Is that a common thread with a lot of these stories?
Yes, I think this is extremely important, because one of the things that apologies do is they raise the issue to the general public. Now, of course, the victims know the stories all too well. They've lived with the stories all their lives. But as your guest was saying, many people perhaps in Belgium weren't aware of these stories, so it brings it to public attention. Also, as your other guest was saying, that some of these people still aren't recognised as Belgian citizens. So, of course, in the public awareness can also help with that. The problem with this, however, is that apologies are essentially stories about the past. And in telling stories about the past, in this case, it's not the children that were kidnapped telling the stories. Again, it's a white Belgian politician telling the story and in some way owning the story.
Vava Tampa, to take it further then, if there's a mea culpa and there's this collective sense of accountability, yes, we screwed up in the past, or our ancestors did, and we did horrific things, is the natural thing then to go, okay, is there a price to pay for it? And might we be looking for reparations to pay? Is that something that you think is feasible and reasonable?
I'll tell you what I think personally. The reason I say personally, because the position within the Congolese community in the diaspora, as well as at home in Africa, or even the African diaspora as a whole, it's incredibly diverse. I do not believe that there is a price, a sum of money, that we could sort of tax the Belgian state or European as a whole for the killings or the colonizations and slavery and so on and so forth. I simply do not believe. I mean, just imagine how much are we going to ask the Belgian state for King Leopold's killings of 10 million Congolese between 1885 and 1908. There isn't a sum of money. So what I push forward, what we are pushing forward, is to have these open conversations. Recognizing, accepting what happened is a starting point. Not simply accepting what happened, we are also pushing for that conversation to be had. So we want the Belgian or the European education system to reflect history, to reflect what happened, to reflect that, how Black people came into existence, because Black people are an outcome of slavery, of colonization. Before that, we were simply African or Congolese or Angolan and so on and so forth. So we want history in education to reflect all of that. And then we also want the European nations to actually take a proactive position in ensuring that their state are actively stopping discriminations, are actively taking action to eliminate all sorts of discriminations against African people, which are a result of colonization and all the atrocity that happened as a result. So in a nutshell, I don't think there is an amount of money, but accepting what happened, apologizing for it, and then pushing forward, making this a national conversation. It's a way forward.
Okay, we're planning to do a reparations program sometime soon. We'll invite you back on because this is fascinating and it's another entire debate almost. Tom, you stay where you are. Vava and Philip, this is where we say goodbye to the two of you. I thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Still to come, Madrid rejects Mexico's request for an apology for the Spanish conquest. 500 years after the fact, does the demand threaten modern-day relations? And Prime Minister Theresa May reiterates regret for a British massacre of Indians 100 years ago. But why won't the UK say sorry? We continue our day of apology with another row over colonial rights abuses. There's a dispute between Mexico and its former colonizer, Spain. The Mexican president sent a letter to the Spanish king demanding the nation apologize for crimes against Mexico's indigenous people during the conquest 500 years ago. The government in Madrid completely rejected that call, dividing political opinion at home in a controversy that could impact Spain's upcoming election. And back in Mexico, some accuse President López Obrador of using history for his own political purposes. Are they right? Randolph Nogel has more.
Andrés Manuel López Obrador started his political career working to empower indigenous groups in his home state of Tabasco. Now, early into his first term as Mexico's president, it appears he's making their issues a national priority. And he's starting with an apology.
Yo, en nombre del Estado mexicano, voy también a pedir perdón por los abusos que se cometieron en estos últimos 200 años, sobre todo por la opresión a las comunidades indígenas.
He's also asking institutions behind Mexico's colonization to apologize, namely the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic Church. López Obrador singled out abuses by Hernán Cortés, who led the overthrow of the Aztec Empire, as well as other conquerors known as conquistadors.
Hubieron matanzas, imposiciones, la llamada conquista se hizo con la espada y con la cruz.
Que haga la corona española este reconocimiento y lo mismo la Iglesia Católica.
López Obrador made his formal request to King Felipe VI of Spain and Pope Francis. The Vatican hasn't issued a response, and as for Spain, so far the Mexican president hasn't gotten the reaction he was looking for.
Jefe del Estado, el rey Felipe VI, no tiene que pedir perdón a ningún país y no va a ocurrir esto, cosa que ha dejado claro el gobierno en el comunicado que desde ayer tienen ustedes del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores.
In some circles, López Obrador's request has been taken as an insult, particularly among those on the right of the Spanish political spectrum.
O sea, es de una ignorancia absolutamente escandalosa y sobre todo es una auténtica afrenta contra España y contra su historia. Que venga un presidente de México a decir que España hizo toda clase de barbaridades en ese país hermano y amigo es algo que yo no voy a admitir.
López Obrador's request is not without precedence. Last year, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized on behalf of his country for past abuses against Indigenous communities. And French President Emmanuel Macron did the same for widespread torture carried out by the French army in Algeria. Critics of López Obrador's request say it's impractical to ask every country in the world to apologize for every misdeed carried out under its flag. But Mexico's indigenous people trace their current political marginalization back to the first days of colonization. And despite López Obrador's legacy as a champion of indigenous rights, some groups boycotted last year's election because they say they fundamentally don't trust the system. No matter whether Spain's king and the Roman Catholic Pope apologize, López Obrador will have to work hard to give indigenous communities confidence that their government is working for them. Perhaps for the first time since their original dispossession. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. In Mexico City, we have Federico Lamont. He's a journalist with El Sol de Mexico newspaper. In Newcastle, in the UK, we have Carlos Conde Solares, a senior lecturer in Hispanic Studies at Northumbria University. And in Washington, D.C. is Evan McGuire. He's an editorial associate at the conservative U.S. magazine, The American Spectator. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Carlos Conde Solares, let's start with you. Should Spain be saying sorry, and should it admit historical responsibility for what happened 500 years ago in what is today Mexico?
Well, in my view, this whole debate has been sparked by a very unfortunate the very unfortunate populist rhetoric of Mr. López Obrador, in that his efforts would probably be better directed, better addressed at trying to improve the living conditions of the indigenous people in Mexico today, rather than apportioning blame for the extraordinary historical events that took place 500 years ago. And I'm also saying this because it would be in everybody's interest for the Hispanic world, which is the world in which 600 million people speak the Spanish language, to present a fraternal and united front, rather than getting distracted with this type of debate that doesn't really take us anywhere. And above all, I would like to say that the historical narrative that Mr. López Obrador is trying to hint at is also a false historical narrative that I'll be happy to elaborate with later on.
So, Federico, when we look at some of the historical narrative, modern Mexico is a mishmash of history, with people, modern citizens of Mexico, having the blood of the conquerors and the conquered, right? This is more complex than just a simple narrative. Is Carlos right that this is just populist rhetoric from Mexico's leadership to distract from issues at home?
I regret to tell you no, because we can summarize the whole history in a paintist, José Clemente Orozco, who blamed the Spaniards for importing a lot of diseases to Mexican old aging. Mexicans, like Aztecs, were great, but when the Spaniards arrived to our land, they brought to us diseases. And the most important thing, that mestizaje, that bring the Mexican culture down, and they have been taking our fortune out of the country. They took our most important treasured identity, and that is why some Mexicans are still blaming the Spaniards for that bad chapter of history.
Federico, yes, there was terrible colonial abuse of indigenous people. The conquistadors did horrific things, right? But is this apology going to make a difference to the lives of indigenous people in Mexico today?
Not at all, because we have 56 different ethnicities in the Mexican Republic, but very deeply inside, they still blame the Spaniards due to what has been happening to Mexico, that we are a third world country, and probably things were different today if we weren't invaded by the Spaniards. That's what most Mexican Indian people think. People from Chiapas, from Tabasco, they are still thinking about that. And they said, why in this world the Spaniards came to our land in 1521?
Okay. Evan, should Spain apologize?
Yes, I would say absolutely not. You can't contextualize an event that occurred 500 years ago in today's lens. The government of Spain today is very different from the government of Spain 500 years ago. 500 years ago, someone from Belgium was actually the king of Spain. He was also the Holy Roman Emperor. So should you be asking Belgium or Germany to apologize? I don't think so. In the same sense, so many different factors play into what's going on in the indigenous communities in Mexico today. And placing that blame on Spain is not good. It's not going to get anything done. There's many other things that can be done to help the indigenous communities in Mexico and throughout Latin America, but placing the blame on Spain for actions that occurred over 500 years ago or around 500 years ago is not going to change anything.
Carlos, why not just apologize, right? We've seen King Felipe say no. The foreign minister called it a weird request from the Mexicans. Why not say, yes, we regret it, it was terrible, and our forefathers did terrible things, and for those who also took Bibles in hand along with the conquistadors, yes, the church is also sorry. Why not just say it? Because then López Obrador has nothing to stand on.
Well, because that would imply validating a historical narrative that, as I mentioned earlier, is simplistic and is false. When Hernán Cortés arrives in Mexico in 1519, the Azteca are not the only people that inhabit those lands. The Azteca were an empire, and the Azteca were a pretty brutal empire at that, to the extent that when the Spaniards arrived in the lands of today's Mexico, they encounter other civilizations like the Tlaxcalteca, like the Totonac, and all of those people very early on become allies of the Spaniards, and they become very, they remain loyal to the Spaniards in their struggle against Moctezuma. To put this into context, in 1487, just a few years before the arrival of Cortés in Mexico, there is a human sacrifice of up to 85,000 people. The Totonac and the Tlaxcalteca will fight alongside the Spaniards against the Azteca. And when I'm asked who that Spain has to apologize, who does Spain have to apologize to? To the Tlaxcalteca, to the Totonac, to the Azteca?
So let's ask Federico
was much more complex than all of that.
So Federico, is it clear to you to whom exactly Spain needs to apologize?
To at least 56 Mexican ethnicities, because they committed mass murder. And talking about what the Aztec did against the Tlaxcaltecas, it was the essence of religion. So that is why I'm inviting your guests to visit Mexico and touch José Clemente Orozco, the most important Mexican painter, who explains in his pictures exactly what did happen. So let us not forget what they did to our great country, and they has to be condemned because, as I told you earlier, they are mass murderers.
Carlos, you're invited to go over and visit. Do you think you're open to a sort of re-education, if you like?
Right. What I think is that the Hispanic people, the Spanish-speaking people, regardless of our race, regardless of our nationality, would be much better served if we abandon all of this rhetoric of apportioning blame for our own history. Because I could also say, for instance, that Mr. López Obrador has two Castilian surnames. Mr. López Obrador is a white man himself, and I think that he's rightly under scrutiny because his government is failing to deliver an improvement to the living conditions of the indigenous people of Chiapas, as Federico was mentioning before, and as many people. So, of course, I'd be more than happy. I mean, I would love to visit Mexico. It is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. But I would like just to note that if anybody has to apologize, perhaps it would be the ancestors of Mr. López Obrador, who is himself of Castilian descent and who is himself living in Mexico. I am not a descendant of any of the 200 people that went on that expedition with Cortés 500 years ago, and I think that we are missing a fine opportunity to really strengthen those historical ties that cross the Atlantic. I mean, I would just like to say that 60% of the people in today's Mexico are of mixed heritage. 30% of the people are of indigenous heritage. To put that into context, only 2% of people in the United States of America are indigenous people. And many of them live in reservations as well. So why aren't people asking the Puritans or the English to apologize to North America? Perhaps because they didn't leave enough people alive to apologize to. And the Spanish government is not going to ask Emmanuel Macron to apologize for the Napoleonic invasion. The Turkish government is not asking us to apologize for the Battle of Lepanto either. And all of this is a rhetoric that, if I may say, is a little bit absurd, really.
So you're saying everybody can shift the goalposts, and then you don't know whose parameters you're basing this on. And just a point to note for all of us is politically this is fascinating within Spain, and we're not quite going to go and look at it. Ahead of an election, we have Podemos, the far left, saying, yes, the Mexicans are right, the government saying, no, they're not. So this could affect those elections coming up. Putting that aside, let me ask you, Evan, Obrador has plans to commemorate the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, or the capital of their empire, along with Mexico's 200 years of independence. That's coming up in 2021. So clearly this isn't going to go away anytime soon. Do you believe, Evan, that he's going to continue to make this a bigger thing, and then something has to give at some point?
I think absolutely he is going to continue this rhetoric of blaming Spain and blaming past historical wrongs for Mexico's current problems, because by doing so, he can avoid blame that would be placed on himself. He can get out of situations by saying that this is a problem that was caused by someone else. This was not caused by me. And he certainly has not caused all of Mexico's problems. Of course he has, and there are many factors that have led to that. And he's a new leader in office. But he's going to continue this rhetoric, and he just wants a blame to be placed on Spain, to be placed on the church and other entities, so that problems can be avoided. He's building it's the Mayan Railroad in southern Mexico, and many native people have spoken out against this. They believe it's going to hurt their environment, they believe it's going to hurt their economy, and that it's only going to benefit tourists and the rich. So they've actually spoken out against this. And he did a native ceremony to get permission from the earth to go ahead with this railroad. And he did this native ceremony as a way to get natives to accept it, but they did not do that. His rhetoric is not going to be met with action, then people aren't going to accept that.
Federico Lamont, one of the arguments is that Chavez has done this before, Morales has done this before. They just want to blame Spain whenever they need to get out of a pickle. Address that.
But that's a different view. López Obrador got the support from at least 6 million of the Indian Mexicans. There are 12 million Mexican Indians who share the common values, and they all agree, and I'm going to try to summarize in one Tojolabal word or 3 words. It says like, Tac Canticle Quilal, that's a Tojolabal word from Chiapas, which summarizes, we all want peace. But peace can be done without blaming the Spaniards for what they have done to us.
Federico Lamont, Carlos Conde Solares, and Evan Maguire, it's been really good talking to all of you. I thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. In the immediate aftermath of the First World War, Indians agitated for independence from Britain. The arrest of Indian nationalist leaders led to riots in the city of Amritsar. British and Indian troops under the command of Colonel Reginald Dyer were sent to maintain order. Within minutes, hundreds of unarmed civilians were mowed down. Let's look back now on the event that still has not seen Britain apologize for the actions of its troops 100 years on.
The tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 is a shameful scar on British Indian history. As Her Majesty the Queen said, it is a distressing example of our past history with India. We deeply regret what happened and the suffering caused.
Well, joining me now is Priyamvada Gopal. She's a lecturer in post-colonial theory at Cambridge University and the author of Literary Radicalism in India, Gender, Nation and the Transition to Independence. And in Victoria, Canada is Rachna Singh. She's a Canadian politician and Legislative Assembly member for the British Columbia New Democratic Party. And back with us from Aberdeen, Scotland is Tom Bentley. He's the author of Empires of Remorse, Narrative, Postcolonialism, and Apologies for Colonial Atrocity. Good to have you, Priyamvada and Rachna, join the program. Rachna, let me begin with you. So the action was horrendous 100 years ago. It was a massacre. General Dyer was, or Colonel Dyer was terrible in his actions, and the people who defended him, they were terrible. But why do you think the British government, despite all of this evidence, and despite the fact that they've said, yes, it was bad, why do you think they've fallen short of a formal apology?
I can go with the examples that Canada has set. We had, during the colonial rule, we had some bad things happening in Canada as well. One of them, which is very well known, is the Kamagata Maru incident. And it happened more than 100 years ago too. But the Canadian government in Parliament formally apologized for it. It has, we cannot change the past, but it has helped us rewrite the colonial, decolonize our history. So I would expect a similar thing from the British Parliament. I don't know what is stopping them. They can take the examples from Canada, which is a country very similar to Britain. I don't know what is holding them back. Right. I can't make that.
Priyamvada. So Theresa May saying it's a shameful scar on Britain's history in India. David Cameron before her and others said, yes, it was bad, but they're not saying sorry. To what do you attribute that?
Well, I think there are two things that are going on. Partly, I think there is a concern about the link between saying sorry and paying reparations. We know that Tony Blair was very reluctant to say sorry for slavery because he worried about reparations. We also know that in the relationship between Haiti and France, France has apologized for its role in criminal slavery, and that opened up a whole discussion about reparations. But I think also that there is a question about what an apology means. And Theresa May this morning, or yesterday rather, expressed regret about a shameful episode in British history. But really, if you think about it, Amritsar was not an isolated incident. Colonialism was a violent enterprise from start to very slow and painful finish. And I have questions about whether it makes sense to apologize for a single incident and pretend, as many in Britain have, that it was an isolated incident of violence that was due to one bad apple, General Dyer in this instance. What we know is that Amritsar was one episode amongst many in which any resistance to empire was violently quashed. And violence was not at all unknown to the British Raj. And certainly by 1919, it was being used very regularly in all kinds of ways. So what I would say is that, well, it's interesting that Theresa May has expressed regret, but I think if you're going to express regret, then you need to be expressing regret for the system of violence that ran across half the globe and ran across 2 centuries. Colonialism was a violent enterprise.
So, Tom, were these strategically chosen words by saying it was a shameful episode? Because it then looks at Amritsar as an aberration rather than something that was nested in a couple of 100 years of an aberration of British colonialism.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that these were very strategically chosen words. Every apology is strategically chosen in terms of its words, because one of the things about state apologies is perhaps like interpersonal apologies where they can be more spontaneous. In state apologies, you get to script them, you get to write them, you have your advisors, you have your lawyers, you'll discuss it in cabinet beforehand. So clearly these are strategically chosen words. They're words that don't actively accept the way in which the atrocity was couched within the larger confines of empire. They don't actively acknowledge the specific role of the state in the violence it committed. Obviously, of course, talking about a shameful event or a scar is also a euphemism as well, which avoids legal responsibility. So These words are not plucked out of thin air.
Okay, so Rachna, after you've heard Tom and Priyamvada say that one of the things could be politically, they fear that this would open up a Pandora's box, and that, as horrendous as this might sound, that when you apologize for a genocide, for example, you can say sorry because there's nobody left to pay because you killed everybody if you were an empire in the past, right? But if you're apologizing for hundreds of years of colonialism and you have descendants and people who were affected by that colonialism, well, these politicians are fearful that it's going to hit their pocketbooks as well. Do you understand that political thinking, Rachna?
Kamagata-Maru, we definitely have. I can give example of Kamagata-Maru again. We do have descendants here in Canada who were advocating for apology, but nothing more than apology. It was not something that we were able to accomplish in a day. It took years for the organizations, for the family members to ask for that. But I think when the government decided to make the apology, it was made clear, I think, that it would be just the apology, not any monetary compensation associated with it. I think that made it a little easier. But we had another incident here, which is known as Chinese head tax. And in that case, the government decided to compensate the survivors because there were still survivors for that incident. Right. So they decided to do that. So I think it depends on the incident and how humiliating it has been for the generations, for the society. I think they make the decision accordingly. But we have both examples here in Canada, the way the government has handled it.
Priyamvada, so healthy, vibrant debate within the House of Commons. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour pushing for a full apology. Is it just because they're the opposition and that's what the opposition does, or are they, doing something really useful here, pushing something that might, come to fruition sometime soon?
Well, I think that I can't say, why they're doing it. I think it is fair to say that elements in the Labour Party have been critical of the imperial project. Corbyn himself in the past has been deeply critical of slavery and has called for Britain to acknowledge its full role in that enterprise. So I'm not going to impute motivations to why people might be calling for apologies or not. I think there are people in Britain, and there have historically been people in Britain who have been critical of the project of empire. I've just finished writing a book about it. And so I think that there are elements in the Labour Party who are genuinely engaged with the question of what happened during empire and the question both of apologies and indeed of reparations. My view is that we should in fact be having a discussion about reparations. It would be different in different contexts. I find Rachna's examples really interesting. The Kamagata-Maru, for instance. Again, it's a fairly contained, limited episode, which would in any case not have very huge financial implications. The real dispossessed in Canada, which are the First Nations, people whose land was taken from them, people who were ethnically cleansed. At that point, you start to have a much more complicated discussion. And although, yes, Canada has made greater strides than America in acknowledging what happened with the First Nations, I think Canada, like the other white settler colonies, has a very long way to go in terms of explaining their own emergence out of land grabbing, dispossession, genocide, corralling people into reservations. I'm not really seeing that discussion happen in any great length or depth in Canada. And there, the question of reparations, I think, would be much more painful than in the case of the Kamagata-Maru. So I do think that the question of reparations, particularly in relation to slavery, needs to be brought back on the table. And one other thing, you don't have to have an apology in order to be made to pay reparations. We know that the survivors of torture by the British in the Mau Mau camps in Kenya did successfully bring a case that was fought in the British courts. Yes. So individual survivors of violence or legatees of violence can bring a case anyway, regardless of whether there's a state apology or not.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. You can just go to the courts without getting a state apology. Rachna, I want you to address the one point before I go to Tom for a final answer. Rachna, the examples you gave, were sort of low-hanging fruit for Canada. much more difficult if you want to talk about proper apologies and reparations for First Nations. Address that, Rachna.
Totally, I totally agree with that. We have a history of, we are on the indigenous lands, and what they have gone through under the state, it's simply not, an apology is not enough. But in the recent years, what we have seen is that the governments have started acknowledging those. I think that is the first step towards making any kind of, to start any kind of healing process for the First Nations. 100 years of systemic discrimination, racism that they went through. But now, I didn't see it before, but for the last 10 years, and it is different governments. And right. I can say about our provincial government and the federal government, both making amends, both making inroads for that to happen. We are not there yet, but it is a process that they have started.
Okay. So, Tom, very finally, I guess, if I walk, and you can disagree with me, if I walk down the streets of Aberdeen and I discuss colonialism, a lot of people would say, well, it was actually English colonialism and not British colonialism, and they might make a distinction between Scots and English as we discussed it. But looking at all of the UK, can we say by the year 2019, where we are right now in April, that the UK has reconciled with its colonial past?
Well, that's extremely interesting that you mentioned the Scotland example, but I think maybe an even more prominent example might be in regards to Northern Ireland,
right?
Well, where there'll be a considerable number of people who will consider that they are still colonised by Britain. So this creates enormously difficult philosophical discussions about apology. When a government apologises, who are they apologising on behalf? Are they apologising on behalf of all the citizens? What about citizens in Northern Ireland that don't accept themselves to be British? What about citizens with different heritages from colonised countries? Should they be both sorry and be apologised to? So you get all these thorny questions when it comes to apologies.
Okay, Tom, Priyamvada and Rachna, it's been fascinating talking to all of you. I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us here on The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.